The town had been sleeping for 40 years. Wooden porches sagged like tired old men. Windows stared hollow-eyed at the desert, as if still waiting for wagons that would never come. The church bell hung crooked in its frame, mute and heavy, a relic from a time when Sundays meant something. The wind didn't just pass through here, it lingered, curling around the corners of buildings, carrying with it the smell of dust, iron, and something older, like the faint perfume of a long-dead lady, still clinging to her shawl. It was into this silence that the rancher came. He had no companions but the horse beneath him, and the wagon dragging behind. The trail was long, sun-hardened, and lonely, but he didn't mind. Men who have lived through enough loss do not find loneliness strange. It is simply the air they breathe. They called him Caleb Hollis, mid-40s, weather-bitten face, hat pulled low. The kind of man who spoke little because there was no one left he trusted to hear the important things. A month earlier, he had stood at a county auction where no one wanted lot number 7, 100 acres of scrubland, a cluster of rotting buildings, and the legal title to what was once Dry Creek. It had been a silver town, then a copper town, then no town at all. The bidding started at $200. No one raised a hand. When it fell to 100, Caleb's fingers lifted slow, almost uncertain. The gavel came down, the crowd snickered, and that was how a man bought a whole ghost town for less than the price of a good saddle. The day he arrived, the sun was so bright it made the rooftops shimmer. Caleb stepped down from the wagon, boots crunching on a street where weeds now grew taller than children once had. He stood still for a while, taking it in. The silence here wasn't empty, it was watchful. The first place he stepped into was the general store. Inside, the air was cool and shadowed. Shelves leaned under the weight of dust. Behind the counter sat a cash register, with its drawer open, the coins long gone, but the paper notes yellow and brittle as autumn leaves. On the counter, he saw something that didn't fit, a candle, half burned, with wax pooled fresh enough to glisten in the dim light. He bent closer. The faint smell of bread reached him. That was impossible. Caleb shook it off. Ghost towns had their ways of playing with a man's senses. He unloaded supplies into the saloon, his choice of home for now, mostly because it had the largest stove. The old mirror behind the bar was cracked, but still caught the light, scattering it in slivers. As the evening fell, the desert air turned sharp and cold. Caleb lit a fire in the stove, heated coffee, and sat by the window. Outside, the last colors of the sky faded to violet. Somewhere above him, on the saloon's second floor, there was a soft creak, floorboards taking the weight of something, or someone. He rose, boots silent on the worn stairs, and pushed open the first door, empty. The second, the same. In the third, a window was open, curtain stirring faintly. The air smelled faintly of something. Soap. He looked out onto the street. Nothing moved. The next morning, the light was so pure it seemed to rinse the town of its shadows. Caleb brewed coffee and walked the main street, taking stock of what needed fixing. The roof of the livery stable sagged. The church's steeple leaned like a drunk. The water pump near the well sat rusted and dry. It was behind the old hotel that he saw it, a line of laundry strung between two posts, shirts, skirts, and a small pair of trousers fluttering like prayer flags. The cloth was clean, fresh. He stopped. Whoever lived here had not left this morning. They had been here all along. Caleb didn't touch the clothes, didn't call out. He knew better than to spook whoever was hiding. Instead, he went back to the saloon, sat down, and poured himself another coffee. If someone wanted to make themselves known, they would. It happened at noon. Caleb was repairing the saloon's front steps when a shadow fell across him. He looked up at boy, no more than 9, stood in the street, barefoot, dark hair, wild as the sagebrush. In his hands, he held a small wooden horse, worn smooth from years of clutching. "You live here?" Caleb asked. The boy didn't answer, just stared. eyes as wary as a coyote's. Then, as quick as a jackrabbit, he turned and ran down the street. Caleb didn't follow. He only watched the small figure vanish between the schoolhouse and the church, swallowed by silence once more. That night, Caleb sat by the fire in the saloon. The wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the sound of something else, lighter than footsteps, heavier than a dream. It came to rest just outside his door. When he opened it, no one was there, only a small loaf of bread, wrapped in a clean cloth, still warm. And in that moment, Caleb Hollis knew two things. Dry Creek was not as empty as it seemed, and the living here did not yet wish to be seen. Morning came on soft feet. The desert was pale gold, the kind of light that made everything look almost holy for a few minutes before the sun climbed high and turned it all into heat and glare. Caleb rose early, not because he had anywhere to be, but because a man who has spent years working the land doesn't sleep past dawn. He walked the town in long, slow strides, taking in what others would call ruin. To him, it was only work that hadn't been done yet. Behind the old hotel, the laundry line still swayed. The clothes were gone now, replaced with emptiness, but the ground told stories. Small footprints, two sets, one much smaller than the other, had pressed into the dust. They led away from the hotel, toward the edge of town, where the schoolhouse squatted like an old woman hunched over her knitting. Caleb followed. The schoolhouse door was half open. He stepped inside, careful not to let the hinges cry out. The air was still, carrying the scent of dry wood and something faintly floral, soap maybe, or crushed wildflowers. And then, movement. At the far end of the room stood a woman and a girl. The girl was perhaps 14, her long dark hair pulled back with a strip of faded cloth. The woman, mid to late 30s, stood with her shoulders straight and her chin lifted in the way of someone who has had to defend herself too many times. Her eyes were not frightened. They were measuring him, as if weighing his soul against whatever danger she feared. "You live here," Caleb said, his voice steady and low. The girl's hand tightened on the woman's skirt. "We do," the woman answered after a long pause. Her voice was like the rustle of dry grass, soft but edged with something sharp. She didn't tell him her name, didn't invite him in. When he asked how long they'd been here, she said only, longer than most folks would understand. And when he asked why, she answered, because leaving isn't an option. There was no anger in her voice, only a wall. The conversation ended there. She ushered the girl out the back door, and within seconds, they were gone. Caleb didn't press. He'd learned, long ago, that forcing a door open too quickly only made people lock it tighter. Instead, he went about his work. That afternoon, he examined the town's old water pump. The iron was seized, the handle stiff, but with oil and patience, it began to groan back to life. By evening, water ran again in Dry Creek. It wasn't much, just a thin stream. Rusty at first, but it was enough to fill a bucket. He left the pump standing there, clean and ready, and went back to the saloon. The next morning, a surprise waited by his door. A round loaf of bread, still warm, wrapped in the same clean cloth as before. He smiled, though no one was there to see it. Days passed like this. He worked on the town, patching the livery stable roof, clearing weeds from the main street, mending the porch of the old post office. Every so often, he would see the boy again, darting between buildings, always watching, but never staying long enough for a real talk. The girl appeared once, standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse, with a bucket. She met his gaze for half a breath before vanishing inside. The woman remained distant, but he began to feel her presence in the smallest of ways. A repaired hinge on the church door he hadn't touched, a swept floor in the general store, a single candle left burning in the window of the hotel. They were not trying to scare him off. They were trying to decide if he belonged. One late afternoon, While Caleb was fixing a loose shutter on the saloon, he felt eyes on him. He turned to find the boy standing not 20 feet away, wooden horse in hand. "That pump you fixed," the boy said suddenly. "It works better now." "Glad to hear it," Caleb replied. The boy shuffled his feet. "My ma says thanks." Then, before Caleb could say more, the boy was gone again, melting into the shadows of the schoolhouse. It was only a small crack in the wall between them, but cracks, Caleb knew, were where the light got in. That night, as he sat by the fire, he thought of the woman's eyes, how they held something both tired and unbroken. He didn't know her story yet, but he would. Not because he demanded it, but because sometimes the telling of a story requires nothing more than time and someone willing to listen. And so the days in Dry Creek rolled on, the work of one man and the unseen work of another household, each circling the other like cautious horses, not yet ready to touch but aware, always, of the other's presence. And somewhere deep in Caleb's bones, he began to feel it. This place was not simply abandoned. It was holding its breath. The first rain in months came to Dry Creek one afternoon, in early September. It was not a hard rain, just a slow, steady drumming on the rooftops, the kind of rain that carried the smell of dust, waking up after too long a sleep. Caleb was halfway through mending the schoolhouse roof when it started. He could have climbed down, but something in him wanted to finish. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was knowing the children inside would stay dry if he pushed on. Below, in the open doorway, the boy watched him work. The girl stood just behind, her arms wrapped around herself, and then, to his quiet surprise, the woman appeared to leaning against the frame. "You're gonna get soaked," she called up, her voice carrying through the rain. "Seen worse," Caleb said. By the time he climbed down, his shirt was clinging to him, and his hat dripped steady rivulets. The girl held out a tin mug of coffee. He took it, nodding his thanks. That was the first time she, the woman, didn't vanish immediately. They stood under the eave as the rain softened the edges of the world. "My name's Mara," she said finally. Caleb tipped his hat, and just like that, something shifted. Not much, but enough to make Dry Creek feel a little less empty. In the days that followed, Mara's voice began to carry across the distance between them more often. She'd ask if he needed nails, if the pump was still working, if he'd seen the coyotes roaming the ridge. And one night, while the desert air cooled under a rising moon, she came to sit outside the saloon. The children were asleep. Caleb poured her coffee, and they spoke like two travelers who had been walking the same road without realizing it. She told him she was born here, in a house now long collapsed at the edge of town. When the mines dried up and folks left, her family stayed because they had nowhere else to go. Her father died of fever. Her mother followed a year later. When she was 20, she married a miner named Eli. He was good to her in the beginning, but the years underground broke something in him, and when the last vein gave out, he left to find work. He never returned. The girl, Ruth, and the boy, Daniel, were what was left of that life. "We survived because this place hides us," Mara said quietly, her eyes fixed on the street, as if seeing something only she could. "The world forgets Dry Creek, and we like it that way." Caleb listened, not with the intent to answer, but with the quiet stillness of a man who knows the value of being heard. In return, she asked about him. He told her only what he could carry without breaking, that he'd once had a wife named Leela, that she'd died in a sickness that came too fast for any doctor to catch. There was no need for more. Some griefs are understood without being explained. From then on, the work became shared. Caleb repaired the church steps. Mara cleaned the pews. Ruth planted flowers where the boardwalk met the street. Daniel oiled the hinges on the general store door, and one morning, when Caleb pulled the rope on the church bell, the rusted clapper swung free, and the sound rolled across the valley, low, strong, and alive. It had not rung in decades. The children laughed. the sound mixing with the bell's echo until it seemed the whole town was breathing again. But peace in the desert is fragile. It was a week later when the first sign of trouble came. Caleb was hauling a beam from the livery when he saw a figure on the far ridge, a lone rider, watching. By the time he blinked against the sun, the rider was gone. That evening Mara's hands were restless, as she needed bread. When he asked, she said, "There are folks who think they still own parts of this land, or people on it." Her voice held no fear, only the edge of a woman who has lived too long waiting for a knock on the door. The next morning, Caleb found the church door ajar. On the floor inside lay a single bullet, polished, deliberate, a message. He closed his hand around it, the cold metal pressing into his palm. Something told him the quiet days in Dry Creek were numbered. The morning they came was windless. Dry Creek lay under a pale, unblinking sky, so still you could hear the faint squeak of the church sign swinging on its rusted chain. Caleb stood outside the saloon, coffee in hand. When the sound reached him, the steady, measured thump of hooves, 3 riders, coming straight down the main street. They were strangers to him, but not to Mara. She appeared in the schoolhouse doorway, her hands gripping the frame, her eyes fixed on the men. Ruth and Daniel stood behind her, silent as stones. The riders dismounted, in front of the church. The tallest, a man with a coat the color of dried blood, stepped forward. His boots echoed against the boards as he walked toward Caleb. "We're looking for a woman named Mara Vance," he said, voice slick as oil. Caleb didn't answer. "She's got debts," the man continued. "Her husband left M behind. Debts big enough to mean we take payment another way." He glanced toward Mara, and the meaning in his look was clear. Caleb set his coffee on the rail. "She lives here under my roof now," he said, voice low but steady. "You'll turn your horses and ride out the way you came." The man's smile was thin. "You buying trouble for yourself, friend." "I'm not your friend." The space between them was small, but the air in it felt heavy as wet canvas. The man's companions shifted hands near their holsters. Mara stepped forward then, her voice cutting through the air like the first crack of a whip. "I owe you nothing. This is my town." The tall man's smile faded. "Lady, the world don't care what you think belongs to you." "That's where you're wrong," Caleb said. "It happened fast." One of the men moved for his gun. Caleb didn't. He only took one step forward, the boards creaking under his boots, and the man froze. There was something in Caleb's eyes, not wildness, but the calm of a man who had nothing left to lose, and no fear of losing it. "You'll leave," Caleb said again, "or you'll find out what happens to men who think they can strip what's already been taken from a woman." The silence stretched until the wind returned, brushing dust across their boots. Finally, the tall man spat in the dirt. "Let's go," he muttered. The riders mounted and turned, the sound of their horses fading until only the whisper of the desert remained. Mara let out a breath. She'd been holding so long it shook her shoulders. Caleb didn't touch her, didn't speak, just stood there with her until the tremor passed. That evening, the town gathered, all 4 of them on the church steps. Daniel lit the lanterns, one by one, until the main street glowed with soft golden light. Ruth rang the bell, its voice carrying far into the dark like a heartbeat strong enough to be heard across miles. Mara stood beside Caleb, her face turned toward the glow. "This is the first time in years it's felt alive here," she said. "That's because it is," Caleb answered. They didn't speak of leaving after that. The town was theirs now, not in the way paper deeds claimed land, but in the way roots claimed soil. As dawn touched the rooftops the next day, Caleb walked the main street, boots echoing in the quiet. He thought of all the places that had died when their people left, and of the rare ones, like Dry Creek, that had simply been waiting for someone to love them awake. He turned back toward the saloon, where Mara stood in the doorway, the children at her side. The church bell rang once more, and the sound rolled out into the desert, telling anyone who might pass through that this town was no ghost anymore. Narrators. Closing words. Universal truth. Some towns are born of gold and silver and die when the last coin leaves. But some, the lucky ones, are kept alive by bread left on a doorstep, by a hand offered in the rain, by the sound of a bell that refuses to stay silent. And if you're listening from somewhere far away tonight, maybe you've known a place, or a person, like that. If you have, keep them close. They're rarer than gold. Asterisk. And now I'll ask you, friend, from where are you watching this story? If it found its way into your heart, let your like and your words keep the old bell ringing, so that Dry Creek, and all places like it, are never forgotten.